project. I'm going to stand because I'll be a panelist later on, but I'm just going to stand here to separate my work as a panelist and my work as the research director of this project. Thank you for really bringing the story of this place into the theme of this mini conference that we are going to be having over the next couple of days. And just to give you a sense of how it started, you will hear me speak about it a little bit more in the second panel after our reception, and I hope that you will join us in our reception on the third floor here at the Heritage Center. And I'm just going to withhold some information in the hope that you will be coming into the second panel and tomorrow and the day after. So that's my trick into keep bringing you here into this event. But as you saw from the program, this is something that we have been meaning to organize and hold for the past couple of years at least, because many people have sort of challenged us into finding these voices, and particularly here in the Mountain West. And any difficulty that we've had in trying to really find any historical data or any research into the history of Muslims in the Mountain West was met with quite a bit of disappointment. I mean, we've scoured every single sort of archives that we could lay our hands on. We went on the internet, we went to historical societies, we went to various departments in many universities across the Mountain West in the 6 states, as you will see later on when I talk about this. And the problem always was that there is really not a lot of information really to begin with. So a lot of the work that we've done was work that was started in most occasions actually from scratch. And I just want to make sure that when you look at the website, when you go home and you check our websites at muslimsinmountainwest.org, that you will see that that work is very much a work in progress. And we're going to take a few months more actually to document a lot more and also to boost the content of the website itself. I want to introduce this panel first as sort of really to start us off. And this is something that is very much part of the sort of the narrative behind this project itself, which has been how do we dissociate the story of Muslims, particularly Muslims in the United States, but also Muslims who happen to be also American Muslims, but not only Muslims who live in the United States. How do they dissociate their experience from what actually happens in the news and the coverage of the news of what's happening in the Middle East or other Muslim majority countries? And that is always a challenge. I remember that when we started this project, we were still sort of recovering from that great paranoia around the Ground Zero Mosque, or so it was called. Do you remember that? And so there seems to be always some kind of big story that, in a sense, colors what we try to do. And when we have these events, then people are always have these things in their mind, which is good because we can engage in a conversation about this thing. We hope to provide some context to how those stories actually evolve. But most of the time, it just becomes a very totalizing frame for us to be able to escape from and then move into something that we want to privilege in terms of the stories of Muslims who live in the United States or American Muslims, which are very rich stories and stories that are not necessarily related to what happens in the Middle East. But again, we need to amplify these voices, and this project, this conference, is about that. Not to provide just the rosy pictures of the Muslim experience and say that that experience is uniform, that that experience is unproblematic, but just to give a sense to non-Muslims who the Muslims in this region are, and how do they live their lives, and what do they read? What do they, not to the, very nitty-gritty details of what do they eat and, what music they listen to, because we're not trying to map them as if we were the FBI. But we are trying just to understand that experience and make sure that there is also a spirit of understanding, a spirit of coexistence that is very much needed at this time. That the story of Islam, unfortunately, is a story of antagonism, is a story of irreconcilable differences, and sometimes irrevocably and redeeming differences that becomes very difficult for us to really jumpstart a conversation about anything. So So I'll be I'm the one hosting the conference. I think I forgot to say my name or my title. Also, as part of the Center for Media, Religion, and Culture, I'm the associate director for the Center for Media, Religion, and Culture. And this project is a collaboration with the Center for Asian Studies through a grant that was given to us back in 2009 by the Social Science Research Council in New York as part of a project, really wide project called Muslims in World Contexts. And so a variety of universities have been doing this, but no other university is doing a local angle as ours. And I think that the richness and the uniqueness of this project comes really from its focus on sort of the local Muslims. What we're bringing, as you will see through these next couple of days, we're bringing people from other places, from the East Coast, from the West Coast, really to tell us a little bit more about that experience. So let me step back into my role as a panelist, and let me introduce this panel, which is, again, about a story that has been in the news. We are talking about really escaping the totalizing frames of the discussion of Islam. But obviously, we hope that you will leave today with a better sense of at least the context around what has transpired over the course of the past few weeks regarding this, the reaction to this film, the film about the Prophet Muhammad and how people reacted to it, both here in the United States and also in the Middle East or in Muslim-majority countries. And so I will introduce our panelists, and I think we will, since we have Reif hasn't been able to join us, so maybe I'll give you a bit more time to recover before you start. And so I will start with Ibrahim Kazerouni, and so I will just tell you a little bit about who he is. He is someone that has been very close to the project, and we've talked to him about the project since its very, very beginning, and we're very pleased that he's been able to join us today. And by the way, Dr. Nader Hashemi from the Josef Korbel International School of International Studies has not been able to join us. He had a personal situation that he needed to deal with, and he sends his regrets for not being able to come with us. But so Ibrahim Kazerouni was born in 1958 in the city of Najaf in southern Iraq. And Najaf is holy to the Shia Muslims. Ibrahim was born into a family of theologians. After being jailed for 5 months under Saddam Hussein's regime, Ibrahim decided to leave Iraq. He spent a few years in the Middle East and traveled to Lebanon, Turkey, and Iran in search of a safe place to stay. While in Iran, he completed his theological studies. Fearful of Iraq's secret police, he fled to England and began his secular education. Ibrahim has taught comparative mysticism, introduction to Islamic law and theology, the history of hadith, Islamic history, Islam for beginners, reading comparative scriptures, particularly the Torah and Quran, and Christian-Muslim dialogue, methodology, and practice. He currently resides in Boulder and works as imam for the Muslim community. He is a former board member for the Housing Justice Interfaith Alliance, Stapleton Interfaith, the religious advisory to the University of Denver Bridges to the Future program, and We Believe Colorado, as well as a former member of the Board of Religious Advisors to the Denver Police Chief. He is the former director of the Abrahamic Initiative program at St. John's Cathedral in Denver. Currently, he serves as a member of Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Community in Boulder. He has received a number of awards for his bridge building and peace initiatives, including Faith to Faith Award for Interfaith Works in 2007, Martin Luther King Award for Services in Peace Building in 2007 as well. In addition to Islamic theological studies, Ibrahim holds an engineering degree in mining, petroleum, an MBA in management, a master in global studies, a master in theological studies at Iowa School of Theology, and currently he's a PhD candidate at the joint ILIF and DU PhD program within religion and social change concentration. He is researching the role and contribution of religions to international relations, and he will be soon a doctor, because he will be defending his dissertation, Islam and International Relations Towards an Alternative Conception of Universality. The defense will be in the fall. Dr. Reif is an assistant professor of political science and international studies at the University of Colorado, Denver, and completed her graduate studies at the University of Michigan. Her current research seeks to explain spatial and temporal patterns in election violence. Her regional specialties are the Middle East and North Africa and the Near East, where she has conducted field work in Afghanistan, Algeria, and Pakistan. Reif was a Democracy Studies Fellow of the International Foundation for Election Systems, where she worked with the Election Violence Education and Resolution Program. She's participating in a variety of democracy projects as the manager for Election Violence and Fraud section. Reif worked in Pakistan during the 2008 National Assembly elections and served as a Carter Center election observer in Indonesia. She has published articles and book chapters on the Taliban, public opinion on Islam and democracy in Algeria, attitudes towards transnational apology in Africa, violence in Pakistan, language polarization in Algeria, women in Algeria, and increasing reputational costs for parties and candidates in preventing election violence. She is also the co-editor of the volume Islam, Democracy, and the State in Algeria, Lessons for the Western Mediterranean and Beyond, which was published in 2005. So I asked the panelists to take about 15 minutes to open the discussion with the statements about how, their reflection, their thoughts and observations about what has transpired in the past couple of weeks regarding the reactions to the film, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A, and hopefully we'll have a nice and substantive conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Going to put the panelist hat on now?
Yeah, you have to be, yeah, you can get this one. I don't know if that one's
Good evening, everyone. It's strange that over 11 years ago, a few days after 9/11, Professor Denny invited me to join him on a panel to have a conversation about how Muslims are misrepresented in the media. And only 11 years later or so, we organized another panel on how the media is misrepresenting the Muslims or dealing with the crisis that we have. I want to start first by thanking Nabil for the late invitation. That didn't give me much time to organize anything. Last night I checked my email, and there it is, an email from Nabil. One of my advisors, Nader Hashemi, has withdrawn, and would I be the person who literally takes over and spend time in this case? I've already told Nader so many times that, look, if you can't do it, then say it from the beginning. But what you can't deal with those who cross over these line of PhDs and become associate professors. I want to start with a statement. I'm not going to tell you who said it and under what circumstance. If you struggle with it, and by the time I finish my 10-15 minutes, if you haven't been able to guess it, then I will tell you. Labeling us and our acts as terrorism is also a description of you and your acts. Our acts are reaction to your acts. This is how we settle all grievances with you. I'm not going to say who said it. Since 9/11, Muslims in the United States have become used to what I call narratives that tries to artificially construct a binary relationship between Muslims and people in this country. The earlier comment about Catholics was similar. We've seen this narrative being used against Jews, against Catholics, against Italian, against others. We happen to be, at least at this particular moment, those who are being used to become the subject of othering in the what we call colonial discourse. Muslims are being portrayed, depicted as irrational, Islam as a religion of violence. And to quote from Mahmoud Mamdani, which is the professor at Columbia, he says, this kind of, he has a very good book, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, extremely useful for those who want to learn a little bit more about this. He says, quote, This kind of narrative makes sense for an audience or readers that are staunchly nationalistic. Pro-American ideological narratives that are needed to soothe their sentiment and shore up their patriotism without questioning any of their unexamined assumptions. So when the uprising took place, and to the degree that it captivated literally everybody, the narrative used by the media was not something unique. It was something that we have got used to. If I may use the old cliche of an old wine in a newish bottle, there is hardly any change. Immediately as the picture shows in, which I hope, by the way, the crafting of the title for this was deliberate.
Yes.
Yes, that literally to poke through and force us to ask these unexamined, ask the question about this unexamined kind of foundation for our own and the way we see the world or ontological basis. Why such a thing is being done? I teach a number of classes at DU, particularly Middle Eastern politics. I believe I'm the only one who started beginning of 2001 teaching the class of Arab Spring. And nobody else did it. So I've been spending a huge amount of time analyzing the narrative, the political narrative. And I've reached the conclusion that unfortunately Western media is unable, incapable, probably is a better way of saying, incapable of in-depth analysis of what we call complex issues. They search for simplistic way of explaining something. And if you were to blame, well, since this used to be an old chapel, to borrow a phrase from Augustine, and portray the Muslims as inherently or permanently compromised beyond reprieve in his answer to the original sin and the concept of free will, that humanity is permanently compromised. So if by presenting Islam and Muslims as permanently compromised because of their faith, that irretrievably damaged, that they cannot be redeemed, then it makes it easier, or at least you don't need to dig deeper to find out what are the real crises behind such uprising and the uproar that we have seen. I was asked to look at how the reaction took place. I would even take issue with a point that Nabil raised earlier, Muslims here versus Muslims somewhere there, somewhere else. Muslims here and there, they share in a common value of revulsion and the double standard that exists in whether Western countries in general, United States in particular. For example, on the one hand, we have Obama talking about free speech, and how many, or even the French president talk about free speech. On the other hand, Muslims are not allowed to have demonstration to express their anger of what is happening to them and disrespect being shown. So that issue is the common denominator. But what is the critical issue here? Once you study the Arab Spring and you see the role of the United States, again the double standard, the role of the United States in trying everything. Just go back to the late 2010 and early 2011, up to early 2012, and up to now in particular, 2011, 2012, has seen the most persistent and consistent attempt by Western powers to interfere in what we call the internal politics of various countries, ultimately for the benefit of the West rather than the people. Jane Petraeus, I believe, borrows a phrase I'm not quite sure whether it was Noam Chomsky who coined it in response to the question why Iraq was invaded. He said, it is the oil, stupid. So he borrowed a phrase, kind of inspired by that phrase, and wrote an article under the heading, "It is not the film, stupid." And then he goes in really in-depth analysis of the situation, one country by country, using Tunis, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, and right across the world, and points to the grievances that these people have vis-a-vis the United States. Trotsky, once the famous revolutionary, Marxist revolutionary, said that every revolution needs a spark. I believe one can accept that what is happening, what happened, the film, I mean, the more I think about it, the more mind-boggling it becomes. 13 clips, part of a film that it was a flop, being shown by a Nas, which is a Salafi kind of TV channel, suddenly being responsible for such an uprising. It just is not acceptable. Those of you who have been familiar with the Arab Spring, they say revolution, you can read the goals of revolution through the slogans. And you can read, apart from the spark that created by the film, you can read the true goals of this resistance and the uprising that captivated the entire Muslim by nearly 90% of the slogans that were being shown by various placards and cries, shouts, screams, and so on, clearly define why the attack against the United States. In Pakistan, it was the drone, the civilian death, etc., etc. In Afghanistan, it was similar. In Lebanon, again, American interference in their internal affair. Yemen, yes, the spark was there, but the primary majority of these signs clearly indicated American interference. In Egypt, it's the same thing. If we were to go back and analyze these countries, people are talking about Arab winter, or the revolution that has been hijacked. I remember early 2012, when I spoke to a number of Egyptian revolutionary leaders, they clearly indicated that the revolution has been hijacked and it's being derailed. What is happening, this double standard, keeping the old, what we call client state, the institution, intact, and allowing minor window dressing to take place. Take the case of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, a strong supporter of free market, IMF, World Bank, totally disrespectful to the goals, what we call socio-economic reasons for the revolution, but at the same time using this spiritual card of the Muslim Brotherhood to quieten down, but the rest are the same. I remember John Kerry, the 2004 candidate for the presidency, when Ikhwan Muslimin had, or the Muslim Brotherhood had the majority of the votes, and he went to see their leaders, came out from a meeting, and he said, I'm happy with the term of event. I said, that's it, the revolution has been hijacked. Because if the US or members of the US administration stamp agreement on the approach of a revolution and the path of the revolution, by implication, it means it has gone haywire. I mean, as a political analyst, if George Bush says it's night, I say it's day. If Obama says he stands for peace, by implication, he stands for war. So what is happening in Libya, what do we have in Libya? Again, a dysfunctional, totally disarray, tribal society that is unable to control anything, and is going through a daily violence. What we see in Libya is similar to what we are seeing in Syria, in Bahrain, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan and other places. Rather than the media paying attention to the alienation of the Muslims around the world, vis-a-vis US foreign policy, it's easier to use this narrative of Muslim rage, Islam and violence. It's their religion that intrinsically pushes them to be irrational and violent in nature, etc., etc. I would like to just stop here, and hopefully, as Nabil said at the beginning, I would be able to address a few issues as they come up during the Q&A. How many of you have guessed the statement? Let me give you a clue. Who was it that Reagan classified him as the best freedom fighter ever during the war between Afghanistan and Russia? Exactly. So that was his statement. He said that this is how we settle our grievances. So these are the grievances that need to be addressed, rather than use the narrative, the simple narrative that tries to construct, if I may quote from Carl Schmitt, the enemy-friend kind of dichotomy, us versus them. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Nader Hashemi from the University of Colorado Denver, and apologize for being late. It's my first semester at Denver, and I've never actually driven to Boulder on my own, although I grew up in Laramie, so I appreciate your patience. And I have a PowerPoint. Should I check to see whether it's working?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, great. Wonderful.
She's gonna do it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I guess the remote. So that wasn't the remote that did that. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, I can see the screen just barely. So the title of my talk is Zooming In on Muslim Rage. And when I talk to my students about the Islamic world, I start off with an image like this and ask them, what do they think of when they see this woman in a burqa with a gun? And the point I want to make is that in the recent coverage of the anti-film riots in the Islamic world, and even to some extent earlier violence in the Muslim world, we rarely see what's outside the frame, especially in the media. And so my focus in this talk is really the U.S. media response to what is going on, and these examples that I'm about to show you exemplify what's out of the frame and is often left out in media coverage. So if you go to the next slide. There, okay. So you see a little bit more of what's outside the frame. I lived in Pakistan for 9 months in 2008 in a hostel with 27 women, and there were a couple of them. Go on. You get a little bit more of the variety. Keep going. Now you see they're helping her load the gun. That's Aruj. Just a little bit of playfulness that's going on. Now you see what we're doing. This is the National University for Space Technology near Islamabad, and 9 of the women I lived with were some of the women aerospace engineers from all over the country. And all of these women, if for the one who wore the burqa, it's very much a Sufi. Her mother didn't wear any kind of headscarf, and she had a lot of conflict over what she was wearing with her parents because she felt very comfortable with this. But all of these women I lived with, they loved to watch Bollywood movies and loved various music, including American rock music. And Aruj, the one in the red shalwar kameez, often wore tight jeans and tight t-shirts, and they're all friends. Keep going. That's some of the guys. There was kite flying, so the guys typically wear t-shirts. This is if we're shoe shopping, she had to go to a wedding. And this is at a book stall in Rawalpindi, and you can see she's got Karen Armstrong's book, History of God. They have lots of books on Sufism. These are very intelligent, thoughtful women who are not only aerospace engineers, but also very culturally aware, published a journal, a cultural literary journal at NUST, with poetry and political commentary and so on for the students. Keep going. And then the next photo is the entire class. And you can see the variety of women in the class, and this year, that year, 2008, was the first year that a woman had been, she was top of the class. Keep going. So I'm going to contrast this to a Google search on Muslim woman. And it's not horrifying. There's a woman who's smiling in a hijab, but you see a woman in burqa. And that's what people see. Keep going. This is an image from the Victorian period. It's known as this style of art as Orientalist art. In the Victorian period, the image of Muslim woman was precisely the opposite. These are lascivious, loose women who seduce men, they wear scanty clothing. And if you go to the next slide, you see just the search for the Orientalist art, and woman. This is how Muslim women were portrayed in the Victorian period, in both European and American art. So I'm going to ask you, who has changed? Keep going. And these are images of Victorian women. And it ties very much into what Dr. Kazarumi said about how these images serve as an other, that we often define ourselves by another culture. In the Islamic world, both in a foreign policy standpoint, it's in the shorter term, Soviet Union, communism, whatever that enemy was. But more broadly, the Islamic world has long served as a counterpoint to our own Western identity from the Crusades onward. And the Victorian era, there was a fascination with women and Orient, it was exoticized, but also seen as this, the news coverage of Muslims at the time where they were described as vulgar. Keep going. So in the 1893 World's Fair, when belly dancing, which wasn't actually called belly dancing by Arabs, rock sharky Middle Eastern dance, was introduced at the World's Fair. The women were fully clothed, and the journalists, I don't have my screen so I can't read the clips from the journalists, but they basically described the belly dancing, were scandalized by this behavior of belly dancing, called it vulgar and loose, and was the basis of corrupting the morals of good Americans. Keep going. So this reminds me, this cartoon I show my students, but it reminds me of something when I was in Afghanistan in 1997 and interviewing them. And they were thanking me for not just questioning them about women. First, like, all these foreign journalists had come in, and all they hammered away on was, why do you oppress women? And I was chatting with a group of students in madrasa. They actually weren't formally Taliban, but they were in madrasa. And they said, well, you know, a group of them had gone with the U.S. Institute of Peace program to bring Taliban. This is 95, before the Taliban took Kabul. And this is when the U.S. was courting the Taliban because Unocal, the U.S. oil-based oil company, wanted to build a pipeline between Turkmenistan and through Afghanistan into Pakistan and the Gulf as a way of counteracting Russian influence over Central Asian oil. So the U.S. Institute of Peace brought a bunch of Taliban and toured city councils and toured various local governments around the country. And one of the Taliban I was with had been on that tour, and he said, well, you know, when we were in the United States, we saw all these billboards with all these naked women. And when we saw that, we were so shocked. We were shocked like you are when you see this burqa. So that's this cartoon that I found recently. To keep going. Getting more to the point of the anti-film riots, I want to think about this image of zooming in. These images that are taken out of context, we don't even know, I haven't looked at the Newsweek actual copy, but it's in the cover. I don't know where it came from exactly. But I mean, you might infer this guy's wearing a suit, but there's still some Urdu, but Arabic writing, and there's red, like blood-like stuff, and he's, you know, shouting.
It's from 2002, actually.
The picture? Oh, that proves my point. Right. That's really appalling. So keep going. So you can go quickly through these. So this is a demonstration I attended in Pakistan in 2008 before the election. And you can see some people wearing marching beards. There are a bunch of flags. They all have Urdu. There's some journalists. These are Christians. So this is a demonstration organized by the All Parties Democratic Movement, which was organizing a boycott against the elections in 2008 and against Bashar. Ooh, I didn't know we were having this problem. So there's Pakistan Tehreek Insaf, which is Imran Khan's party. You may be familiar with that. The Pakistan Workers' Party, which is the left-wing party, Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, which ended up participating in the elections, but is the centrist mainstream party. The Alliance of Islamist Parties, which boycotted the election, Pashtun Nationalist Party, Left-wing Socialist Party, and the Pakistan Christian Congress, which is advocating for a return to reserved seats for Christians. So all of these people are part of this demonstration, and the diversity that is within and the protests that are occurring within the Muslim world are rarely covered. Of course, the lawyers movement got a bit of coverage. Keep going. I didn't know the screen. So this is just to show you how in this demonstration it's really small. That all the journalists that were zoomed right up close, as you saw in my first series of pictures, there's probably about 80 people, maybe 150 people, and the police are lined up and they're kind of bored. Keep going. And they're even this, okay, good, his head isn't cut off. This, like, they're smiling amused. This was not, the media were there, but this was not a major demonstration. Keep going. This is a lawyers' movement that happened in 2007 after Bashar dismissed the Chief Justice, imprisoned the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and this was one of the largest secular demonstrations, and the lawyers' movement marches lasted for several months. But if you search Google, this is a search with before the anti-film riots started. Just search Muslim protests, and you get all of these kind of angry faces, and it's quite different than the lawyers' movement. You don't see that. Keep going. So really, this is just to repeat what's been said, a continuation of the whole tired Orientalist narrative, which looks at Muslims as a monolithic entity and ignores the diversity and division within that part of the world. Okay, so I have a bunch of statistics that are not going to show up, but essentially it's to show the billions of people who, the many hundreds of millions of people in each part of the world that are Muslim. I keep going. There's a map that will be cut off, but you can see how most of you are probably aware, if you're at this talk, that the vast majority of Muslims reside outside of the Middle East, and many of them are in India. And I don't know, I haven't followed the riot daily news since the 16th when I started compiling some data on the number of people rioting, but in India, where there are more Muslims than in Pakistan, you don't see much coverage of that. There was also a demonstration in Afghanistan where they had Muhammad in hearts, and one of my friends posted that picture on Facebook, and I was like, hey, that's just not part of our narrative. It was a peaceful demonstration. So I want to contrast this with the Arab uprisings. Some who argue it shouldn't be called Arab Spring, but and one is that if you did watch the media coverage of the Arab Spring, recall the Tahrir Square, the wide-angle zoom. There was a wide-angle coverage, especially on CNN, of Tahrir Square and the crowd size estimates. There's a lot of debate about how many people actually showed up. And they ranged from the estimate of 250,000 to about 1 million to 2 million. Probably was closer to 250 to 750,000 based on Harvard social scientists' techniques for looking at quadrants of space to estimate the crowd size. And we saw that wide angle. The recent anti-film riots, including this horrible cover of Newsweek, in Egypt showed Tahrir Square in little, just as zoomed in. If they had shown Tahrir Square the way they had shown it, that wide angle, what is outside of the frame, it would have been mostly empty. And my friends in that part of the world said, oh, well, yes, we're seeing the coverage and some people milling around. And the nature of the crowd as well, you saw this, the images of the protests in Pakistan, people in suits, people with beards. The Arab uprisings that brought down the authoritarian regimes in this part in the Middle East were the types that there were children, women, elderly people, people in suits, all walks of life. the anti-film riots consistently with young men, hooligans, that there are some evidence that many of them were soccer hooligans, but these are the people that are part of what we call in social science a youth bulge, where you have a large number of people who are educated during the oil boom and socialist period of the 70s and early 80s. Many people in many of the countries in the Arab world got a free education up through a master's degree. They come out, they used to be able to count on state-owned enterprises to just get a job, and that collapsed in the late 80s, leading to what I would call the first Arab Spring in Algeria in 1988 to 1991, with students protesting at the lack of jobs. So the people who were on the streets for the anti-film riots, as Professor Hashemi emphasized, had grievances, and those grievances are specific to different contexts, often socioeconomic. And they differed vastly from the crowds. What was so surprising to me is that the same media who had been covering both of these events that happened relatively close together, it's like they forgot all of the things that they had been saying about the diversity of the crowds at Tahrir Square. It blew my mind that the memory in this discussion of why did they hate us, the lack of memory, I think we really need to question the media. It's not just a matter of lack of condemnation. Some people wrote also in response to some things that I wrote on Facebook, well, where are the Muslims who are condemning this? Well, actually, the MuslimAmericans.org has a running list of all the condemnations that have been issued, and I'm sure you've heard that there are over 40,000 protesters in Libya who brought down the headquarters of one of the Salafi, Nas, I think one of the Salafi groups, and there was just not the same level of coverage. And even when they mention it, the visuals are not there, the difference between a crowd of 2,000 versus a crowd of 4,000. So keep going. In those first few days of the riot, I compiled data, which is, and I can keep going. This isn't my spreadsheet, it'll think, no, yeah, that's just Muslim populations. Okay, so this is cut off. The countries are all on the left, and they're all that, I didn't include Indonesia. Actually, I created this for my class, and I'm teaching Middle East politics, so I didn't cover Indonesia or Pakistan. But the percentage on the left is the percentage of the population based on my lowest estimate of the crowd size from largely the Wall Street Journal. The number in thousands. So the largest number was 250,000 in Egypt at the top, and the lowest number of demonstrators was like 6,400. I think that was in, let's see, I can tell you if I have the rest of the spreadsheet. 6,400 in Iraq during the Arab uprisings, pro-democracy, anti-authoritarian movements. So the largest percentage of the population that demonstrated in the Arab uprisings was a very tiny percentage of the population, about 2% at most. If you compare that with the film riots, which is the green, let's see, the third column, the column that I'm pointing to right here, that is the percentage of the population that was involved in the anti-film riots as of September 16th. About like 0.005%, about 2,000 people in Egypt as of the 16th. Now in Pakistan, there are about 50,000 that was organized, but still, when you think of it as a percentage of the population, it's minuscule. And compared to the pro-democracy uprisings, it's pathetic. And yet there is no effort to take that objective crowd estimate, although the media did say, well, how big are these crowds really in the Middle East during the Arab Spring? So people, I don't know if it's a subconscious effort to discount what's going on. So why is this important? What's outside of the frame is important for that we're actually negotiating our diplomatic relations now through the media in the way these were covered, then people, the way in which Romney responded and asking and demanding the leaders to say something about free speech, and then there were statements issued. These images matter, that they resulted in these calls for a certain kind of diplomatic response. And it's a continuation of the Orientalist tradition, which has been very counterproductive in improving relations with the West. And here's what I have. It also alienates our allies. So all of these pro-democracy protesters the lawyers movement, the people I live with in Pakistan, they see this. They are not anti-Americans and this anti-drone policy, but they still have a positive view of Americans and democracy. And it alienates them when they see the Western media's inability to differentiate between a few who are out in the streets against the film and then ordinary Muslims. It also causes the US public to misunderstand what's going on in that part of the world and to justify and stop questioning things like drone strikes and other policies that actually are technically illegal. And it allows the US public to indulge in a childish idea that we are under attack when we are actually the aggressor. And that is, I think, is a very childish. We're indulging in the media. We're actually coddling Americans to continue to believe that we are under attack, and therefore do not have to question the kinds of policies that are being imposed on the Muslim world. And so it's not just a matter of an academic matter of discussing and framing in media, but rather it has real implications. And we think that by selectively supporting a few democratic movements in this part of the world, that somehow makes up for years and accumulation of policies. And I'll just go to one last slide to summarize. I wanted to make one point disagreement with Professor Kasperny about whether the Arab uprisings have been derailed. And that's just a graph that a German paper and a Swiss paper picked up my analysis and published it with no American media did it. So that's the percentages of the population. Keep going. So that you can scroll all the way through the last slide. The reason I disagree that the Arab uprisings are being derailed, two things. I think William McCarran, who wrote in Foreign Affairs before the anti-film riots, that very last, just keep going to that their jihadists were starting to lose ground because Islamist parliamentarians are participating in politics. So Ennahda won the election in Tunisia. The Muslim Brotherhood won the election in Egypt. And the jihadists are losing ground as they see mainstream moderate Islamists participating in politics and are needing to foment and find some alternative. And he's quoting from William McCann's article, efforts, websites of jihadists that they need to find a new state, Somalia, Afghanistan, maybe after withdrawal, that they can restart, renew an effort to try to establish some sort of caliphate. The fact that these film riots erupted when they did is a sign that the Islamic radicals, the jihadists, the violent militants are losing ground, and they're desperate. And violence is often a sign of desperation. And so while there's some instability, there's some, the revolution, Arab revolutions are messy. It is the Arab world's 1848, and the 1848 revolutions in Europe were first called the springtime of the peoples, and then they started calling it the Red Summer because it got very bloody. But in the end, there were unknown outcomes. There were 4 different outcomes that an article by Emerson on the 1848 revolutions identifies. It's not a foregone conclusion that all these things are going to become democratic, but there is a great deal of foment. We should not be comparing the Islamic world to the U.S. today and saying, why are they irrational? They're undergoing something that has been postponed by Ottoman rule and colonialism and is now occurring. And so it may seem like the Red Summer or the Arab Winter, but we will come through this. And the fact that there is jihadist violence is a sign that things are moving in the right direction. Thank you.
I
just muted mine. I think it should work.
All right, it's working. Okay, just at the risk of not repeating here. Okay, at the risk of repeating or just going over things that both Megan and Ibrahim have already ably, I should say, addressed, I'd like to just briefly address a few things here and talk about how really sad it is that we have to explain the obvious. That the media have failed us. And when I talk about the media, obviously I don't want to give the impression that there isn't a sound voice in the media today that's doing a better job than everybody else. Actually, there are good rays of hope. I enjoy listening to Deborah Amos on NPR. She talks about what's going on in Syria, and her accounts I find them very thoughtful and also very historically grounded, as opposed to people who are sort of dabbling into the contemporary and not really understanding exactly what happens here in some parts of the Middle East or the Muslim majority countries, and how those can be, the context could actually benefit a lot of sort of the average American in understanding exactly what's going on. I was asked to write a reflection on the Muslims of the Mountain West project and for a book about Muslims in world context. And I found myself titling actually this reflection, Unveiling Obsessions, Muslims and the Trap of Representation. And I opened this reflection with a very telling example of an article by the New York Times, which, you know, even the coveted New York Times actually engages in sometimes very superficial and I would say also childish, really, reactions to what's going on. And so in this article that they published in May of 2012, it was a feature article about veiling in Iran. And it was called Your Veil is a Battleground. And it showcased the work of Iranian-born photographer Kiana Hayiri as she reflected on dress and public life in Tehran, among particularly young women in that country. And the photographic slideshow that accompanied the article was fascinating. It was really interesting, and it revealed the hidden life of Iranian women, veiled and without clothing. So you had side-by-side images of a woman who was veiled, and a woman, and then the same woman unveiled in sort of a private setting, right? So in her room or something like that. And the article made the now tried the romantic argument that behind the veil lies a secret world of social transgressions and a yearning for individual freedom. And the article read, Mrs. Hayiri returned to Iran in 2010 to explore the dual lives of many young women who are expected to behave and dress modestly in public by covering their hair, arms, and legs. But behind closed doors, these women act very much like Mrs. Hayiri's Canadian friends, dating, singing, studying ballet, and even swimming. This is sort of the New York Times really engaging in this, what I feel, or what I believe is really just very disturbing description, actually, of what might go on. But what I find interesting about this statement also is just this obsession with unveiling things about the Muslim world, right? So this idea that people said, oh, now that we're seeing these protests against the film, this is the true colors. These are the true colors of what actually has been going on in the Muslim world. So this idea of the Middle East and the Arab Spring, it was just all a farce. It was a blip and a temporary one, because this is what the Arab world, or this is what the Muslim majority countries are all about, you know. And so this narrative, which I think was said earlier, which is very formidable and remarkable, and it just pervades this kinds of discussion and conversation around Islam, which I find very much reminiscent, obviously, of the romantic Orientalism of the paintings of Delacroix, right? Sort of this idea of the harem. Let's unveil what actually lies in the harem, or in the hammam, right, in North Africa, the public bath of North Africa, where women went, as if Delacroix actually had any access to these public baths where women actually bathed naked. But he imagined what this would be like, but it was all about sort of unveiling this obsession. And I feel that the same thing.
Fetishism.
Yeah, exactly. And what I see that this is a narrative that keeps repeating itself about, let's look at what the Arab world or the Muslim world, right? So this label also of the Muslim world as this really monolithic, uniform entity is very problematic. But let's look at behind the veil, and what actually lies behind the veil is quite disturbing. This is sort of what the narrative goes like. And I'm afraid that today we are at the mercy of really a tragic situation where we have extremists actually on both sides, both in some of these countries where the protests have been coming from, and also here, right? And so if you look really at the film itself and how it was made and who supported it, I did some research about stories that actually were more or less similar. The ground zero, this quote unquote ground zero mosque in New York, and sort of who pushed for that story really to percolate to the surface, for example, was Pamela Geller, a blogger who is someone who's very prolific in this sort of Islamophobic circles. She's been circulating through her blog called Atlas Shrugs. So she's been really promoting this idea that Muslims who are here in the United States should not be allowed to practice their religion because their religion is at heart a radical one, and there are irredeemable differences between the West and Islam as a religion. And she really has basically given herself this role of manning the barricades of Western civilization. Right? She's seen bathing in the beaches of Florida, and she's talking to Hamas as she's wearing her, two-piece bikini, and she's telling Hamas, "Do not come here to take this away from me. This is my freedom." This is the woman actually who actually coined the Ground Zero Mosque phrase, and was able to push for it until Newsweeks and the New York Times and all the mainstream media actually picked up the story. The person who gave the most of the money for the film, Steve Klein, is someone who writes for this blog almost every day. And it's interesting just to see these connections, right? And then look at the connections of extremism on the other side. Right? Look at, for example, the Salafi channel, the 24-hour Salafi channel, and Ness in Egypt, and how really they were the ones who fomented this sort of interest about this. I mean, the film, I watched the film before this thing happened. Someone sent it to me, and I think it was the people behind the film, and they sent it to me, and they said, "Watch this, you would be amazed." And when I watched it, it had 504 views on it on YouTube. I mean, go and see now, it's got millions of it. But it's interesting how sort of the extremists back in Egypt, and I find this really sort of fascinating. I think what Megan said about the Salafis really feeling like the Muslim Brotherhood has, sort of taken the rug from underneath their feet in terms of their ability to still claim the moral ground and the upper hand, the political upper hand in Egypt. They feel very nervous, and so they use any situation they can exploit to get to the Muslim Brotherhood, and the world becomes the stage for that conflict, which is, I think, sort of very interesting thing to keep in mind. But again, going back to this idea of the narrative of the rage, right, which I think is the same as the narrative of the unveiling, and the obsession of unveiling that I talked about earlier. I mean, that narrative is not new, and I think here Ibrahim would agree. This is something that goes all the way back to, obviously, we talked about sort of Orientalism, but also in terms of the ability for a scholarly narrative also to influence policy. And I'm thinking here, a lot of people talk about the Clash of Civilization, and particularly Samuel Huntington. Actually, before the Clash of Civilization, and before Huntington came out with his thesis, he borrowed that from Bernard Lewis. Right? In 1990, the title of this piece that he published in the Atlantic, and later on also in the New Yorker, and then he came up with a scholarly article, was "The Roots of Muslim Rage." And in it, he basically says that Islam has failed Muslims. Right? That Muslims have to shed the core principles of their religion if they want to get into the modern world. Now, who do we see in this article of Newsweek? Who is the writer of the lead article? It's Nader Hashemi, right? Who is originally from Somalia, and she was a Dutch parliamentarian before they found out that she had actually forged her citizenship papers to gain the political asylum in Holland, and was kicked out of Holland. And she came here to the U.S. She's working for a conservative think tank on the East Coast. Now, she has a very legitimate story to tell, obviously, about how she was abused as a young girl. She was almost forced into genital mutilation. She was about to be given as a bride to someone she didn't want to be. That's a whole story to be told, and I would, read that story every day. But the problem is the provocation that she brings with her to that style of doing it. This is the same person who wrote a book, her latest book is called Nomad, and then the rest of the title says, From America to Islam, My Journey Through the Clash of Civilization. I mean, it couldn't get more explosive than that. This is someone that Nicholas Kristof, when he did the review in the New York Times, he said, this is someone who likes to throw verbal grenades by reflex. This is what she does all the time. She's this kind of very provocative style. Doesn't get us anywhere. And she had ways in which she did that before. She did it in the Netherlands when she teamed up with this filmmaker, Theo van Gogh, and basically about the abuse of women at the hand of their husbands. And that was a story to tell again. But the provocation was disproportionate in the sense that the film was too provocative, was trying, instead of really addressing the issues, just basically made a huge deal out of this. And obviously the women who were the subject of that film that Theo van Gogh actually made were the first one to leave the theater when they saw what the film actually did. Because they thought it was just too much over the top. Right? So again, we're brought back to this kind of idea that just like in Bernard Lewis' article on the roots of Muslim rage, that there is something inherently problematic that's blocking Muslims from entering the modern age. Right? And then so by harping on that same theme through a cover, as the Newsweek cover, and then really talking about Muslim rage or outrage, as so Time magazine thought that they were doing something smarter, so they called it outrage. But it still actually had rage in it and still had the same kind of effect, actually, about what was happening. The problem with that is that we are not dealing with the issues. We're not addressing the issues. We're not talking, what have we learned from the cartoons affair of 2006? Except that it's the same thing over and over and over again. We have one crisis, it becomes a public crisis because some people really push it to the top of the media agenda. And the journalists, for the most part, are not going really to address the very significant issues here at play. And they're going to engage in this very superficial, again, I agree, very childish presentation of what is actually at stake. And making it sound like these people are, they're angry at us, not because of what we did, but just because of who we are. Right? Does that bring up the Bush doctrine to some of you? Right. They hate us because of who we are. And I mean, still, Obama today actually uses some of this phrasing, which is a little unfortunate. Although it's much better than Bush, obviously, but still, this is something that I think needs to be addressed. And as someone who teaches in a journalism department, it's painful to see journalists actually engage, at least journalists at the mainstream level. And again, the New York Times of the world cannot hide here, because they're also, as I show here, and I have countless examples where we can actually show this. Although they have very good journalists who are capable of doing these things. And I don't know if it's a matter of censorship, of self-censorship, or if it's a matter also of political economy, or just, pages that need to be read, articles that need to be read, and competition as well. Newsweek did this because ultimately they wanted to draw the attention of people. And they said, we have gone the sensationalist way because we wanted to jumpstart the conversation. Now, they jumped the gun. They didn't jumpstart the conversation. And I would just end by how I think Muslims were really, particularly here in this country and in some majority countries, Muslim majority countries, like Egypt and Tunisia, were really smart in how they appropriated the hashtag on Twitter, rage, Muslim rage. And then they started really showing the world that Muslims actually have a sense of humor. Again, which is not something that we should be spending our time really trying to prove. But we do. This is what we do. We have to do a panel in order to explain to people, and not to you, but just to address these things. And it's very unfortunate. And one of my favorite ones was this woman who said, I lost my son at the airport, and his name is Jihad, cannot call up his name. And then they put the hashtag Muslim Rage.
But no one sees.
That's right, yes. I mean, things like that. I mean, it just, why that story actually made it. I mean, you saw it on CNN, there were stories about this in the New York Times. But then they treat these stories as sort of like nice, cute stories, but not stories of substance that actually could be the essence of how Muslims are talked about, or Muslims talk about themselves. And I think that's funny. If you want more stories that are really funny on Twitter, follow that Salafi. He is a hilarious sort of Egyptian who's not a Salafi at all, and he makes fun of Salafis, but he does it in a very intelligent way. And so, again, it shows you that there is a conversation happening in these countries. You know, the idea of democracy, the idea of give and take and exchange of ideas is not something that is specific only here, although there are forces that prevent sometimes these kind of conversations from happening. But still, people are eager and hungry for conversations. And I think as we saw from those pictures, you can see that these are vibrant societies, and sometimes we don't acknowledge that. That much at least, because those stories can be a little boring. They're just basically the same stories that we hear everywhere else, but not the stories obviously where you have, you know, I think someone said, it's no longer remarkable to see it's no longer remarkable to equate the Muslim faith with contorted faces. Right? I mean, that's what we see. We see Muslims making these sort of contorted faces in pictures, and the narrative is always the same. And I'll stop there, and we'll open it up for discussions. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
First, I wanted to thank you very much. It's been very enlightening, particularly for me. And I have two observations. One is that we are, in the United States, very uneducated about what you've just spoken about. And would there be some way to get factoids into the media, telling us what the facts are? And, you know, just as you said, maybe 30-second blurbs that go over and over again. You know, Americans, as we learned from weapons of mass destruction, will believe anything if you hear it often enough. Okay? So we need to believe the right things if we hear it often enough. And secondly, I've often wondered why our military is in these countries. Isn't there some way that we get the leaders of Muslim countries to tell us very politely, we appreciate your help. The leaders, it has to come from them. Appreciate your help, but please, we don't want your military here. Get out, you know, set a date and be out in 6 months, be out in 3 months. We don't want you here. Let us run our own things. You don't want us running your things. So we don't want you running our things. Please get out.
I'll answer, well, on the second one, which I think, if only it were up to them. I think that would be my answer to that, and I'll leave it to the others to reflect a bit more on that. But on the media, where to get information, I think that, and here, as someone who has a journalism degree, who works with journalists a lot, I also would like to take the defense of journalists sometimes and say that they are under a tremendous amount of stress recently. I mean, in terms of the pressures that are placed on them to produce on a cycle of 24-hour news, which really contributes to the mediocrity of the news process in itself. And also the cutbacks, right? The layoffs. I mean, the Denver Post has had layoffs. I mean, we had a newspaper that was eliminated just a couple or 3 years ago. But then you have other news sources where you can get information. I find it fascinating that 60%, for example, of the traffic of Al Jazeera English website comes from the United States. And why? I think it's because Americans are smart to understand the difference between fact and commentary, right? And so what you get in Al Jazeera, and I'm not saying that Al Jazeera necessarily is a perfect channel, but all I'm saying is that this is a channel that's still spending money to open up bureaus in Africa and in Asia and other places that are underserved by the media and by journalists. And I think that that's where you actually can find first the fact, and then there are the editorializing kind of programs. And unless the United States really figures out a way of re-energizing again their news operations, there's nothing that we can do about it, because unfortunately we live in a sort of fact-free type of journalism.
I was thinking more in lines of the Muslim community paying for ads on Fox and CNN.
Oh. Well, we have a representative from the Muslim Public Affairs Council, who's actually, maybe she's here, maybe not yet.
I'm up here. Up here.
Oh, up there. There we go. And this is the kind of stuff that they do. They try to leverage the media. They try to tell them there is another way of looking at things. Maybe they work with Hollywood on popular stories and how to actually privilege these sort of alternative visions of what it means to be Muslim. But sometimes it works, but for the most part it doesn't work. But these institutions are there, and these voices are there. You need some help to get people like that. And sometimes the media, unfortunately, just are not interested in these stories.
I had a thought on the media question. I remember after 9/11, there were some public service announcements that may have been paid for by the Bush administration, and we're Americans and they're Muslims. And I thought those were quite good. I don't know what happened to them, or the funding dried up, but and you see this MuslimAmericans.org website that has all the condemnations of the violence of the recent protests and press releases issued by Muslim Students Associations, and they're not picked up. And one problem with putting factoids out, even if you did it in the media, I shudder to think what kind of hate mail a mainstream channel would get if they started putting factoids about Islam. There's an organization called Campus Watch that is associated with Front Page magazine, which is Daniel Pike's blog type. And I've been warned by people who are tenured faculty to be careful, because what you say in class, in your classroom about Islam and about Arab-Israeli conflict, because they can derail your career. So you have to be very, very careful. So I imagine the same sort of thing happens to media, and just anecdotally talk to people who work at CNN. Well, if they brought in a particularly articulate Muslim, they were told that they wouldn't bring in the administration or the organization, people wouldn't put their guests on that show again. And so they tended to have right after 9/11, had this guy with a kufi, and he was really inarticulate. And I thought, this is the person? And someone, I don't know if this is fact, was referring to him, they bring him on all the time because he's acceptable to certain audiences who want an image of... Yes, exactly. And then the second question about military presence, why didn't they say, please get out? Well, that is something it's not necessarily up to them, but one thing that happened after 9/11, I had started studying with the Islamic world in 1992 when I started college, and read Samuel Huntington's article, and then 9/11 happened, and I wasn't entirely surprised, but then I was like, why? And it's interesting, why then? Why didn't it happen 30 years earlier? And in studies of terrorism and the way violent movements work in general, people tend to try nonviolent tactics first, and write op-eds, and they worked with, so going international at the level that Al-Qaeda did with 9/11 and earlier, some of the cross-national attacks of U.S. forces, it actually started with domestic opposition against their own regime. And even if it's not the same organization doing it, as you know, there's some, with the Black Panther movement in this country, it makes the civil rights movement like Martin Luther King look more moderate. And so there's one organization trying something and one tries violence, but they often wait and feel that, well, it's not happening fast enough. And so my question is, why not earlier? And that they actually were saying, please get out. There are op-eds all the time in Dawn News in Pakistan saying, why can't they just stop this? And of course, we don't pick it up, and I don't know if it stays
Well, Megan was writing, is writing as far as Muslim community was asked after 9/11, why don't the Muslim community condemn the attack? Although 99.999% of the Islamic centers in the United States and Europe, their imams, religious leaders, board of directors condemned the attack, but the media would not reflect. I still remember those days, my arguments with CNN and other places trying, they would bring in one of these 0.0001 person and make him or her representative of the whole sound for him. And when I called back to send an email or no response whatsoever, we have we are living in a structure with power differential, which is not in favor of the Muslim community. You have to really struggle to be able to even get small op-eds published by Denver Post or Rocky Mountain. I have tried, if you go back to 2002 and early 2003, 6 of my articles were published. After that, stopped. None whatsoever. And I've tried repeatedly. To the point that now my articles are being published online rather than on newspapers and so on. That's number one. We have a problem of representation. As Nabil said early on, if there is a political economy or utility in misrepresenting Islam for the sake of audience, call it whatever, this is not going to change no matter how many times we send articles and communicate and try to establish and say, look, these are the facts. So it's the notion that the absence of a correct image of Muslims within the media is somehow due to the shortcoming of the Muslim community in trying to present themselves is not correct. Although, at least I have to put some of the blame on the Muslim community for misrepresentation or ill-representing themselves. But at least this is not the way that it is in reality. But as far as the first question, Nabil put it on a kind of a synopsis, only if they could. You show me a leader within the Muslim world, particularly the Arab, which is not a puppet regime, that the United States did not work with them, for the past 33 years, from Hosni Mubarak to Ben Ali to Gaddafi, now documents with Yemen, Ali Saleh, even with Saddam, with the rest.
Still working politically?
We're still working with a number of other ones that they are, American foreign policy is what we call self-centered. And only political benefit or economic benefit as far as it goes. Democracy, human rights are nothing more than narratives that are catchy for the media. Outside that, you have who's asking attack on Syria and Arabs to invade Syria? Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Morsi made a statement.
Yes, but to a degree, but Morsi got $6 billion from Qatar and Saudi Arabia to save it. And who are these leaders? The most despotic, undemocratic, tyrannical leaders that we can see. Just look at the uprising in response to this film in what we call the Shia section in Saudi Arabia. And how they were treated. Bahrain. On the one hand, we talk about democracy in Syria, but Bahrain, we sell them all the weapons to kill the democratic movement and totally destroy it. We don't have a democratically elected. I was surprised in my own country, Iraq, that Maliki had the guts to stand up to Bush when they asked for an extension of staying in Iraq. He said he wasn't prepared to extend it, and he wasn't prepared to give a kind of carte blanche to the American soldiers to do what they want, and similar to the capitulation agreement signed with Iran in 1960s, which led to the revolution. We don't have anyone that can stand up. Saudis are well known. Just leave them with the money, womanizing, wandering around, and all that stuff. That's all they care about. Their stomach and under their stomach. That's fine. The rest, I don't think they are even intelligently capable of analyzing what is happening around. Who's paying the Salafis in Egypt? Who's paying the Salafis in Tunis? Who's paying the Salafis in Libya? Who's paying the Salafi cells in Morocco, in Algeria, in everywhere else? So the notion that somehow these people are free elected, capable of expressing their opinion. Remember 1973 October War between Israel and the rest of the Arab world? What happened to Faisal? Because of the oil embargo, it was his nephew in this university that was paid by the CIA to go back and assassinate him. So I think we need to reflect to see the real world through a different lens.
One more question. Fortunately, we have to, well, actually, fortunately, we have to go to reception upstairs. But one more question. Yes?
I am more than slightly amazed that we could go through over an hour talking about Muslim rage and the word Israel never comes up. I would think that certainly the United States alliance with Israel has created a lot of animosity in that part of the world that has then been exported. And having traveled there, I've talked to a lot of people that talk about their Palestinian brothers and sisters. They're very aware of what's happening. And when you have a prison camp like Gaza, when there's 1.5 million Muslims trapped behind barbed wire, and you have the United States allied with Israel who is holding that in place, that seems to, for me, always be a kernel of Muslim rage. And certainly there's a pro-democracy movement, but as you pointed out brilliantly, the United States has always, well, not always been on that side. So I would like you to address maybe the kernel of the U.S. relationship with Israel that then may extrapolate globally to Muslim rage.
It's interesting that you brought this issue up. If you go right across, say, from North Africa to the Middle East, it's not working. If you go from, say, North Africa to Middle East and then go to Far East, depending on the urgency, and read the signs, the slogans, the most urgent issues that have led to alienation vis-a-vis U.S. foreign policy, those are the ones that have been presented first. It doesn't mean that other issues are not there. But if you go a little bit further east, this issue of Palestine in Indonesia and Malaysia became the focal point in the slogans, because now there are no drones that would kill their civilians. There are no constant attack against them. Yes, economic control, etc. But then the issue of Palestine and Palestinian issue and the relationship with Israel, etc., took the center stage. But it doesn't mean that the issue in Yemen, it doesn't exist in Yemen or in Egypt. There are still camps in Egypt that are the ones that were expelled from Palestine in 1948. They're still living there. In Syria, in Beirut, I went to 2 of those camps. They're still living there. And they are issues, but depending on what is the critical. There is a concept in Arabic, aham and muhim. the most important and the least important, or at least first degree, second degree. Once you have American drones killing civilians on a daily basis, that takes center stage. It doesn't mean that the Palestinian issue is absent, but it is partly there.
I would agree with that, but I mean, I was in Algeria in 2004 and 2007, and you can see when things are going badly, the government, I don't know if the government, but there are various charitable organizations that show Palestinian children bloody and images that we wouldn't see on our own television, but it isn't the primary grievance against the U.S. There's still a memory that the U.S. went along with the French in allowing the military to reverse the results of the first round of the elections in 1991, which was almost won, and so far probably the most free and fair election that has occurred in North Africa and the Middle East proper. And I was there during Abu Ghraib, and the Islamic Studies and the Department of Economics at the University of Algiers Caribbean campus, they had a display with pictures of the Abu Ghraib images and then dead children in Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza. But that quickly passes, and there's still this sense that there's an authoritarian regime and it's exporting a great deal of oil to the United States. And so I think these grievances are, for the most part, not related. It's particularly the Arab uprisings. These anti-film riots, even though the media, it's not clear exactly whether it was actually financed by the Israelis, as the filmmaker claimed, was clearly trying to film it. But that wasn't the prime. The anger was directed against the U.S., not against Israel. And just the nature of the crowds that were out there, a lot of those young boys don't remember the Intifada or the 73 war. And I don't know that they're told a certain narrative, but I think they're even more socioeconomic.
Yeah, I would only say, I agree. And I think I would only say that there is a remarkable difficulty here in the U.S. to talk about this, particularly if you come from the Middle East. I'm originally from Morocco, and so when I, go on this conversation about this, I know that people are saying, well, there goes the Arab against Israel, there goes the Muslim against Israel, and I think that there is a chilling effect, really, in the media about really just how far can you go to criticize the state of Israel and what they're doing. Not, sort of engage in sort of an anti-Jewish propaganda or make this sort of a religious confrontation, but just the ability to state the obvious sometimes and say, well, this rage, if we want to call it, although obviously we spend an hour trying to say that it's not rage, but if it is emanating from somewhere. So it's not that these people just woke up one morning and said, let's go and burn the embassies. I mean, it's years and years, and we know this, but it's hard to get these points across, particularly about the state of Israel. What's his name from Time magazine? Klein. What's his first name?
Joe.
Yeah, he recently rebuked Netanyahu when he tried to interfere directly into the elections by making Obama look very weak on Iran, right? And he was completely, he was criticized right and left by the media as, anti-Semitic, and it's just, the chilling effect is just extraordinary, and it does not allow people really to express any dissent about Israeli policy. And I think that has to change, and that needs to really get to Americans in order to understand exactly some of the dynamics of Middle Eastern or Muslim-American relations. And on that note, I invite you to go upstairs, please, to the third floor. We're going to have a reception, and we can still talk about these things. And there is another panel discussion at 7 p.m. that would be Life as a Muslim in the Mountain West. And we have some fascinating speakers who will talk about that experience. And please join me in thanking our panelists for, I think, a wonderful